Okay, we are live with Alexander Mercouris in London, and we are very honored, very happy to have with us once again on the Duran, Jim Jatras. Jim, my friend, how are you doing?
Great to be here, gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Jim, where can people follow your work? I follow you on X. Is that the place where people can find you?
That is the only place. I'm an old boomer guy. I don't have a big social media profile, just X.
All right, I have that X link in the description box down below. I will add it as a pinned comment as well. Highly recommend you follow Jim on X, formerly known as Twitter. Jim provides great commentary and analysis on X. So before we get started, Alexander, Jim, a quick hello and shout out to everyone that's watching us on all of the platforms. A big shout out to our locals community. A thank you to our moderators in YouTube. Alexander, Jim, let's talk about the Iran war, and we have some breaking news, I guess, or a breaking truth social post. Let's discuss it.
It's very confusing because we get one truth social post after another. They're not always consistent with each other, and they often take us in different directions. But I think that beneath the surface, there are continuities about this conflict which we can discuss and explore, and which you can become very visible when one does analyze and explore them. And I cannot think of anybody better to help us identify and see these continuities and to get us to understand what is actually going on than Jim Jatras, who has been with us on previous programs. We've discussed Ukraine, we've discussed other issues. He knows the political system in the United States. He's worked in the US government. He has some understanding of these institutions that make these extraordinary decisions. And I think he's been one of the most astute and insightful commentators up to now in this conflict, as well as the various other conflicts that we have seen. So, Jim, we've had an extraordinary couple of weeks, and we've had an extraordinary couple of days. We started a military operation, which is clearly intended, indisputably intended, to achieve regime change in Iran. You only have to go back and read what Trump was saying and what Netanyahu was saying to see that. Then the anticipated regime change didn't come. We had a war of attrition, and then we had a massive succession of hugely escalatory steps, one of which tumbled one after the other over the last couple of days. Strait of Hormuz, tightly controlled by the Iranians. We've had military deployments by the United States and all kinds of threats. Then we had an attack on a gas field in Iran. Then we had an Iranian counterstrike on energy facilities in Qatar. Then we had an attack on an Iranian nuclear facility in Natanz. We had then the Iranian counterstrike against Dimona and Arad. Dimona is where Israel keeps its enormously important nuclear reactor, which produces the raw material from which Israel makes its nuclear weapons. We then had an absolutely astonishing statement from Donald Trump talking about a 48-hour ultimatum with massive strikes across the Middle East and across Iran, intended to destroy and knock out its entire power system. And then, just a few hours before this ultimatum was due to expire, we have the 5-day pause. We have the rowing back, it seems, of the ultimatum. We have talk about possible dialogue with the Iranians after all. Where are we? Should we take any of this seriously? Are we actually going to see an end to this conflict? Or is it just another punctuation mark in a horrible escalating story? Over to you, Jim.
Well, as far as the 48-hour fire and brimstone threat that Trump issued 2 days ago, there's a couple ways you could look at his backing off of it today. One, it's taco. Trump always chickens out, and that he intended to follow through with it, but now he's decided not to. I think the more likely explanation is that he never intended to follow through with it, that he intended to do exactly what he did today as a cover for that Marine Expeditionary Unit that's coming over from the Far East, getting into position for an attack on Kharg Island or whatever else their target might be. They're supposed to be arriving in the theater, even as we speak right now, getting prepped for whatever that attack is going to be. I think that's the most likely explanation. Also, maybe a little profit taking by people close to the White House on the oil markets. No, that would never happen. And now the other possible explanation, which I don't think is very likely at all, is that there is really some kind of back channel going on. And if that's the case, I guess I would say shame on the Iranians. I mean, if they haven't figured out by now, after they got set up for this attack by the talks that were going on with the United States with those two, flim-flam artists from New York, Witkoff and Kushner, that, in a very treacherous way, set them up for this attack. If they haven't learned by now, and for that matter, if they haven't learned in Moscow and Beijing, that you simply cannot talk to these people, there's no way they will negotiate with you in good faith. I don't know what to say. I throw up my hands that you can try to engage in classic diplomacy with the United States today, but there just isn't anybody to talk. And by the way, it's not just the Trump administration. I mean, I think this has been the case for some time. Trump has just added his own peculiar personal level of crazy to the mix, but we could talk about American politics, what this means for Trump, impeachment, the House, and all of that sort of thing. But I don't think people outside the United States appreciate how totally corrupt and dysfunctional the American state has become at the highest levels, that we are simply not capable of the kind of flexibility to change course from longstanding patterns of trying to subdue any country that we consider to be disobedient, whether it's Russia or China or Iran. And that is continuing in this very, very strange way. So I guess the bottom line is, first off, I expect things to escalate. I don't know if the 5 days are going to run out. In fact, I wouldn't be at all surprised is that Trump will talk, we're talking, bam, he'll hit him with an attack, just the way we launched the attack on February 28th.
Well, this is actually the key point, because one of the consistent pattern of this whole story is of extreme hostility towards Iran from the Trump administration and from the US political class, and an a single-minded focus on achieving one thing in Iran, not an end to nuclear enrichment or doing away with its ballistic missiles. These are just routes to that objective. The objective clearly is the overthrow of the political system, the removal of the political structures that were created in Iran following the 1979 revolution. In other words, the end of the Islamic Republic. It is regime change in just two words. That, it seems to me, is entirely and exclusively what this is about. Did the United States expect regime change to happen immediately after their initial strikes? And were they taken by surprise by the fact that it not only did not happen, but that the Iranians have been able to hit back?
We hear a lot about how the Israelis somehow led Trump into this. I think that's a complex thing. I don't think it's a simple calculation. Yes, he was fooled by the Israelis, or he's somehow under their control. I think the nature of the relationship between Israel and the United States is much broader and deeper than that. However, he may have been misled as to how successful this initial strike was. In other words, he was told by some people that, hey, boss, this ain't going to work out too well. But I don't know how forcefully he was told that. And he had a lot of other people, including Hegseth and Marco Rubio, telling him, bam, this is going to be a knockout blow. People have noted that the United States has been all over the map in terms of what our goals are. Get rid of their nuclear program, get rid of their missile program, get rid of their relationship with their proxies, et cetera, et cetera. Regime change, as you point out. Remember what Trump said, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago now, that the only acceptable outcome is unconditional surrender. I mean, I guess he was channeling his inner FDR from, where was that, Casablanca, or wherever that was. That, there's nothing, that's the zero option. I mean, there's nothing more you can do to a country than unconditional surrender. I guess what we're gonna have to have, a Battleship Missouri signing ceremony or something like that. Once it was, I guess, aircraft carrier, the signing ceremony. Once the Iranians run up the white flag, all those other things are subsumed into that goal, which he has never retracted. Now, it could be certainly regime change. It could be a synonym for that. Also, failing that, you end up with a wrecked state like you do in Libya or in Syria. That would be also an acceptable outcome for both the United States and the Israelis, I think. But anyway, I don't see any way out. People keep talking about an off-ramp. I don't see what the off-ramp is, unless, again, the Iranians have taken leave of their senses and will come back for more lies in order to set themselves up for another attack. There's a very strong parallel, I would say, between the Russian refusal of a ceasefire in Ukraine and the Iranian refusal of a ceasefire here. Because why should we give you a respite just so you can rearm and come back at us again? And anybody with any sense would realize that's the only purpose of any temporary off-ramp at this point.
Absolutely. Now, can I just make my own point here, which is that I think that there is no confusion about what the American objectives are. The American objective is regime change. The reason they have come up with all of these alternatives, enrichment, ballistic missiles and things of that kind, since the fighting began, is because as regime change was not immediately achieved, and it began to seem that it might not be achieved in any proximate period of time, they had to come up with some reasons for keeping the fighting going and giving the impression that, there was an achievable objective that somehow fell short of regime change. But I think it's purely a product of an inability to achieve regime change, or regime collapse, if you prefer, in the last few hours. I think that has always been the objective, and it remains that objective still. Now, if you go to the Iranian media, and of course I do read the Iranian media, but only those parts of it that are in English, they seem to be well aware of all of this.
Yeah.
They are repeatedly saying exactly the things that you've been saying. We can't trust the United States. We've been led up the garden path by them repeatedly. We are not interested in temporary arrangements with the United States. We set out our own conditions, which are pretty extraordinary conditions. Extraordinary, maybe not so extraordinary given what's happened, but a few weeks ago, people would have said that they were extraordinary. Why would the Iranians, from a practical point of view, agree to a ceasefire now? Because they are successfully resisting. They have the pressure on the energy markets. It doesn't make any kind of sense. And if we're talking about discussions going on, back channels and things of that kind, one senses that back channels, if they are taking place, they are saying no. The Iranians are saying no. What might induce them to change? Because there's no word so far that they've changed. Everything that we've heard about this 5-day announcement comes from the United States.
Yes, and to tell the truth, I've heard speculation that at some point the Iranians will say, "Okay, fine, we can end this war, but on our terms. You have to remove your bases from the Persian Gulf. You have to lift the sanctions, et cetera, et cetera." The trouble is I don't see that the United States can actually make that offer. I don't see how Trump can make that offer after he's painted himself in the corner here. And let's be honest, even if he did make that offer, what's the likelihood we would follow through with it? I mean, if we could promise to lift the sanctions, would the sanctions actually be lifted? No, I can't see any circumstances where the sanctions will be lifted. Certainly Congress would not go along with it. So and this is where you get to American domestic politics. I've been out at the polling stations here in Virginia last few days because we have this referendum going on gerrymandering the congressional districts here in Virginia. It's all about Trump Trump. That we have to rig our elections here in Virginia because Texas is rigging theirs in favor of the Republicans, and all comes down to who's going to have majority in what in my Senate days we called the House of Reprehensibles, and that if Trump gets impeached and this war goes very badly, it's not inconceivable if the Senate also goes Democratic that he's going to be removed. There's also a lot of talk, as you know, about the 25th Amendment. The guy is clearly losing it. And look, I say this with some degree of sadness. I mean, maybe I'm just a sap, but I voted for the peace president in 3 different elections. And somebody once said, I think it was Tom Woods, no matter who you vote for, you get John McCain. And, there are a lot of people who wanted to believe, coming in, and not only obviously with Iran, but especially when the Ukraine war, he was going to solve that in one day, right? There was a lot of hope that he could come in and do something different. I just don't think that's possible. I just don't think that there is. The United States today reminds me so much of the Soviet Union in its latter stages, where it is so sclerotic, it is so inflexible, it is so incapable of changing course and reforming itself, that all can happen is it gets to the inevitable crash, whenever that crash comes. And maybe that crash will come because of the impact on the global economy of this war. And so I think that's another reason Trump needs to find some way to pull a rabbit out of his hat and come in and win this somehow. Maybe the next step is seize Kharg Island, and now we've got the Iranians by the throat or wherever part of the anatomy you want, and they'll have to capitulate. Maybe that's the thinking at this point, if there is any thinking.
Well, this is what I would like to come to next, because what you're talking about points to escalation.
Yeah.
I mean, if the Iranians are not going to shift their position, and they may very plausibly see this 5-day pause as a sign of weakness, and that might make them harden their position rather than soften it. So if the Iranians reject this, if they say, no ceasefires, our position remains exactly as it was. Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz remains under our control. It continues. We set out our conditions. We're not going to shift our conditions. If the United States, if Trump is not prepared to discuss these impossible things with the Iranians, what alternative politically does he have, save for escalation? And the point about escalation is that if you get into this kind of game, the other side repeatedly over the course of this conflict has shown that they are able to escalate too. We attack Natanz, they attack Dimona. We attack South Pars, they attack the facilities in Qatar. Where does this stop? How does this stop?
And I think that's the question everybody's asking themselves, because the Iranians they do have escalation dominance, but they're proceeding in a very deliberate way. As you point out, it's, tit for tat, I guess. I guess everybody likes the tit better than the tat. But anyway, they keep doing that. And that makes sense from their point of view. But where does it end? And unfortunately, I think a lot of people think it ends eventually with an Israeli nuclear strike. I mean, if we get to the point where the Iranians really do have an upper hand and they can keep escalating and they're not going to surrender, the other side doesn't want to surrender either. What else is left at that point? And that's something I'm sure that not only in Tehran they're thinking about, but again, back in Moscow and Beijing. I mean, it looks like they understand. Look, I think the natural tendency in both Russia and China would be say, can't we find a way to de-escalate this? Can't we find some way to stop this crisis? I can understand that, because you don't want to get to the point where everything blows up in a nuclear cloud. But on the other hand, they also have to understand that they've got the United States now caught kind of where the Americans wanted to catch the Russians in Ukraine, where basically we're the ones bleeding. We don't have a good way out. And our international credibility as a dominant global power is being sapped very, very badly in this conflict. From their point of view, you'd want to see that continue, but how do you get it to the point where a state that is incapable of seeing the situation it's in and pulling back from it just simply does something that's totally crazy, and again, I don't think it's probably going to be the Americans, although even that I would not rule out that Trump might eventually consider the use of nuclear weapons, but more likely it would be the Israelis. That's something the Iranians have to think about, and also relates to, okay, at what point do they decide that their only protection at this point is to do something that I would have done in their shoes a long time ago, which is acquired a nuclear capability. I mean, if you're faced with a choice of being Libya or North Korea, I'd rather be North Korea. And I'm, especially with the removal of the old Ayatollah, the supreme leader, who was the issuance of the fatwa against the nuclear weapons, I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're reconsidering that, and in fact do announce in the not too distant future that yes, we do now have a nuclear capability.
Yeah. Now you have worked in the U.S. government. Again, it seems to me that the U.S. went into this conflict with a whole series of misunderstandings or complete they didn't understand the nature of the foe they were taking on. They assumed that Iran was much weaker than it turned out to be. There are lots of reports that they didn't anticipate many of the moves that Iran has made, closing the Strait of Hormuz, for example, securing their internal positions. I find that very difficult to understand. How is that possible? The United States, we're told, has the biggest intelligence apparatus in the world. They're supposed to know a huge amount about everything, everywhere. How is it possible that the United States did not anticipate simple things like the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the ability of Iran to launch missiles across the Middle East, the effectiveness of Iran's drones, given that we had a huge amount of information out there, which made that clear to everybody? All three of us knew about these things before the fighting started. How could it be that the President of the United States was not informed about them and thought that this would all be a walk in the park or a little excursion, as he has talked about it?
I think there's two factors to it. One is the imperial hubris that took over completely in Washington with the end of the first Cold War with the Soviet Union. These people actually talked themselves into believing we are supreme. We're going to control the entire world. No other power has any legitimate interests that we must respect. And if they will not bend to our will, then nobody could stop us from bringing them to heel. I think that point of view is virtually universal in the ruling establishment and in Washington, D.C. Maybe there was some truth to it in the 1990s and the early 2000s when we were that powerful, or at least almost as powerful as we thought we were. And to some extent, people are still living in the past in that regard. They still think that we are that powerful relative to everybody else. The other thing is, and I think maybe it's a corollary to the first one, is that the whole system of political advice based on intelligence has been so corrupted that the yes man factor of anything, only things get to the top that the boss wants to hear. It's almost like I guess Hitler in the bunker or something like that. Is that anybody with bad news is saying, boss, we can't do that, it won't work. That's going to get filtered out of the system by the time it gets to the top because it clashes with what they know to be the case from their ideological moorings.
Do they have any idea of the military problems? Because I have been listening to what a lot of people, and I'm talking about military people, have been saying about opening the Strait of Hormuz. Incredibly difficult military operation. Capturing Harg Island, an incredibly difficult military operation. A British Navy captain, a person who is a died in the wall neocon, by the way, who writes at the Daily Telegraph, says, we have no ability to deal with sea mines. The Royal Navy has no ability to deal with sea mines. The US Navy no longer has that ability either. So if the Iranians stop seeding the sea, the Persian Gulf with sea mines, we're basically stuck. There's nothing we can do about that. Does any of this get through to the president? We've seen that there's been these attacks on Iran, the air attacks. Apparently, they're also not going as well as anticipated. We've seen problems. It does seem as if the Iranians were able to intercept and damage at least one stealth fighter jet. How does the planning system work? Because I don't understand how the planning system works if it repeatedly makes, I'm talking now about military decisions, ends up making bad military decisions time and time again.
Well, Trump did invite the Chinese Navy in. Maybe they need to take him up on his offer. I mean, after all, they could go in, secure their own energy supply, tell the rest of those guys they're on their own, feed some intelligence. What does Trump say at that point, by the way, if the Chinese show up to secure their own energy lifeline? Look, you said he's a British Navy captain, which means he's the equivalent of a colonel. Yes, you'll find some colonels and some majors down there who really know what's going on, but how many of them are going to fall on their sword by telling the boss what he doesn't want? Even if they report at that level, as I say, it's going to get filtered out. If you want to be a general, if you want to be an admiral, then you don't bring bad news to the boss. You just don't. And I think that's part of the corruption of the system we have. Maybe some of it gets through it, let's say, at a very technical level, but I don't think anybody's going to go to the boss and say, we can't do that. Rather, they want to say, well, it's going to be very difficult. We have to face this, but you can do, boss, 0 defects. We will deliver. I think that's what we're looking at now.
This is the making of a disaster.
Yeah.
Now let's look at this further, because you talked about the outside powers. You talked about the Russians and the Chinese, and I think you're absolutely correct. On the one hand, they're looking at this as a conflict which does open up possibilities that they can take advantage of. It bogs the United States down. They might gain leverage over it. At the same time, they're very, very worried that this thing could spin out completely out of control. And I was reading the central bank chair, Nabulina. She spoke about how, yes, this conflict might have advantages economically for Russia, but there are also long-term risks as well. What do you think the balance of thinking is? I mean, you had to deal with the Russians. I always get the sense that with these kind of conflicts, they tend to be very, very cautious, and securing stability is always their primary concern. What do you think that they're telling the Iranians, and what do you think they might be telling the Americans? And would they be prepared to act as a go-between?
I think you're right about their tendency toward caution, but the fact of the matter is caution isn't always the safest option. If you're dealing with people who are, as I say, simply not behaving in a normal way, and you simply cannot make a deal with them, being cautious in the hopes that eventually they'll come around and see reason and sign a reasonable agreement and stick by it is not cautious, it's delusional. And I think, unfortunately, at least from my point of view, there's still many people in Moscow and Beijing who are still invested in the current system. In other words, the Chinese, and look, I can understand the Chinese. They don't want to see the collapse of the United States economically because they have such a strong interest in continued commerce with the United States, selling a lot of stuff to the United States. I mean, we've heard talk that, if the Chinese really want to bring us down, they can dump all their treasuries, which they've been doing incrementally, but they haven't done anything sudden that would crash the United States dollar. I honestly think, there's an old proverb, I believe it's a Greek proverb, that danger can never be overcome without danger. That if, yes, it's dangerous to consider the possibility that the United States suffers such a humiliating defeat here, hopefully without a lot of bloodshed, just because we can't accomplish our goals, that actually does crack the global economy, cracks the US dollar dominance and so forth, and changes the world situation fundamentally. I don't think that's what the Russians and the Chinese are inclined to do. I think they're inclined to do what you basically said. Can we somehow find some way that the Iranians can show the Americans that they're not going to succeed, and then we can step in and find some off-ramp? The trouble with that off ramp is, and I'll be very blunt about this, it can only be a lie coming from Washington. Washington will never honor its commitments under any off ramp. And I think that's the dilemma they find themselves in. Do they fully realize that or not? I mean, you look at somebody like, Mr. Lavrov, who's probably the greatest diplomat, certainly of the current day and for many decades in the past. And back in 2007, he said that the behavior of the United States today is reminiscent of the experience of Bolshevism and Trotskyism. He's absolutely right. But how do you negotiate with people like that? How do you expect them to keep their commitments? And that's what I really am somewhat concerned about, that they're taking a situation where there could be a fundamental shift and just shifting us back to where we've been for the last couple of decades that can only proceed toward escalation on a global scale eventually.
Do you think the Russians, and specifically the Russians, are involved in helping Iran? There's been a lot of discussion about this. There's been many rumors that they're providing intelligence, that they've trained Iranian drone operators, that they've helped the Iranians improve their missiles and the reach and the flexibility of their missiles. There's now rumors that there's a Russian air defense system operating in northeastern Iran. It's very difficult to put one's finger on any of this, but do you think this is actually happening? I know a lot of people doubt it.
You're as well informed about this as I am, and probably better. I think it's very plausible to me. I think that they're going to do whatever they can do with plausible deniability, so they're not directly involved. Although I have to assume, with all of these capabilities, if they are there's got to be a lot of Russian personnel along there with them. And so, but again, there's a history to that. I mean, remember, there were Soviet pilots in the aircraft we were fighting in Korea and even in Vietnam. So I wouldn't be at all surprised that they're providing personnel along with some of this hardware. Again, as we recall from after the June war, the Iranians under President Pezeshkian had wanted to believe they could come to an agreement with the Americans because the Iranian business community wanted that. Apparently, they were disabused of that in June of last year, and they finally took the Russian and Chinese offers, say, yeah, we got to beef up our defenses however we can. Of course, that's only a period of a few months. These capabilities take some time to build up, but I'm guessing a lot has been done in the meantime and continues to be done.
Have you been surprised by how tough Iran has been, at the fact that it's held together, that it's absorbed the blows, that's been able to hit back, that it's conducted a very intelligent, at least I would call it intelligent, strategy of response? I mean, you can make ethical criticisms, and I know many people do, and political criticisms, but it is a war, and in a war, you have to fight a war in a certain way if you're going to succeed in it. So, to me, it looks intelligent. Have you been surprised by this? Because I will say straight away that I, to some extent, have been. I was not sure how stable Iran was or how coherent the decision-making process inside Iran would be.
I feel exactly the same way. I mean, you've heard a lot of people say that Iran wins this war simply by surviving. That if at some point that the Americans and the Israelis decide that this regime change is not going to work, well, we'll just declare victory and go home, and the Iranians can wipe their forehead and say, "Phew, we survived, we win," And it doesn't look like they're willing to do that. They say, "Hey, look, the Americans have now got their mammary gland caught in a ringer here. We're not going to let them go. We're not going to let them go. That they may want to disengage, but we're not going to disengage until we get whatever their end game is." And that's, of course, we haven't seen precisely from Tehran what their end game is, but it would have to be something like dismantling all of those bases in the region. How they get a commitment on removing sanctions, I don't know, because again, promises won't be kept. There has to be some way to dog walk that, where they continue their attacks on Israel and on the Gulf states and on American assets in the region until various concrete steps are taken to actually relieve those sanctions. And the other thing, of course, is we've heard talk about some kind of a toll system through the Strait of Hormuz where the Iranians are able to derive compensation from the traffic going through there in compensation for all the damage they've suffered in this war. Is that a possible off ramp at some point if the other side really does cry uncle? As I say, I don't expect them to cry uncle. I expect them to escalate and eventually do something very, very stupid and dangerous.
Can we talk about the Gulf states? Because they have had considerable influence in the United States. They've invested very heavily in the United States. They have a long-standing animus against Iran. They have been caught in the middle. They've been very, very badly damaged by this war. Their own long-term internal stability is probably now in question because they're so dependent on the price of oil, on oil exports. What are they doing? Are they telling the Americans escalate, or are they telling the Americans stop? Because it's very difficult to get a sense of what they're saying because one is reading constantly contradictory things. And what sort of influence do they actually have in Washington when these kind of decisions are made?
You know, it is very hard to know because the reports we're seeing are all over the place. But it's pretty clear that just as this is an existential war for Iran, it's become an existential war for Israel and an existential war for the Gulf states. As you point out, these are very fragile regimes in all these countries. Probably the most fragile is Bahrain, with you have a Sunni regime sitting on top of a large majority Shiite population. But the other ones are also pretty much pie crust regimes as well that could easily come crumbling down, and that could cut either way for them. They may realize unless the United States wins this war, they are going to go down one way or the other, especially if we are forced to withdraw from the region. Or they may figure, we saw those reports, what was that, 2 years ago when the Chinese had brokered, maybe it was 3 years ago, Chinese had brokered a deal between Tehran and Saudi Arabia to normalize relations. I wonder if that was just part of a deception from the beginning. I mean, maybe the Chinese were deceiving themselves too. Oh, these guys are going to make nice and have peace, when in fact, they were all gearing up for a war against Iran. It kind of reminded me of the way when Assad was readmitted to the Arab League, and he told the Russians and the Chinese, "I don't need you anymore because the Russian, the Iranians, I'm going to be back in the good graces with all my Arab friends, and I don't have to really worry about fighting this war anymore." Again, that was just to set him up for the regime change. So I don't know what they're in terms of their influence in Washington. People tend to throw the word neoconservative around very loosely when it comes to Washington. Every guy who's a practitioner of aggressive policy is a neoconservative. Neoconservatives are a specific ideological stripe, ultimately deriving from, it's a lot more from Trotskyism. But you have a lot of other aggressive circles in Washington connected with people like, Brian Berletic points out, with all the corporations and the arms industry, the so-called Vulcans, people like Donald Rumsfeld or Condi Rice, or even somebody like John Bolton, who's not ideologically a neocon. He's more of a great power chauvinist, like Cecil Rhodes or somebody like that, not Leon Trotsky. So it's, but I would say the Gulf states and the Saudis, they spend a lot of money on weapons, most of which they can't use very well, but that's another way of basically paying back Washington with all the petrodollars that lubricate the American political machine. They're allied, of course, with the neoconservatives and the pro-Israel crowd, but they're not identical to them. They do have distinct interests. I don't think they have enough throw weight by themselves, though, to divorce themselves from their political allies in the neoconservative camp. So I think they're kind of stuck. I don't know how much agency they really have. They're more like they really are satellites in many respects.
If Iran comes out of this in ways that make it appear the victor, is it not going to also be the dominant power in the Persian Gulf area and much of the Middle East? Isn't Iranian influence going to greatly expand And isn't that going to have an effect in the southern Persian Gulf? Aren't the various Arab states, whatever Arab states emerge out of this, aren't they going to have to look increasingly to Tehran? Isn't the Arabian Peninsula altogether going to be much more under Iranian influence? And isn't that something that must cause alarm in the United States, in Israel, but of course also in Turkey too?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that. If they survive in a way that does involve, especially if the American bases in the region have to be withdrawn, at that point, even the pretense, the facade of American protection for those regimes, assuming they can stay in power at all, means that they have to see which way the wind is blowing, and it's blowing from Tehran. I suppose that would be especially the case if the Iranians do end up becoming a nuclear power, which they very well could. In that sense, it's not only, as I say, existential for those regimes, but for the global American empire, because the Middle East, in some ways, is the crown jewel of the global empire. Without that, how do we maintain our dominance in Europe? How do we project power in the Far East? All this was, in terms of not only bringing down the Iranian government, we also wanted to make sure we could choke off the energy supply going to China. This is absolutely essential to the American program for global domination. If that collapses and we're no longer the dominant power in that region, and Iran is, maybe not being a major power in the same way that Russia and China are, but certainly a very respectable mid-sized power that is a regional hegemon, that is a revolution from in international affairs, and really is the death knell of American global dominance, I would say.
Because I've been thinking a lot about Vietnam and the conflict in Vietnam, and I do think there are some actually rather interesting parallels in the sense that the United States got involved in Vietnam, and we now know clearly that that was a war of choice. If you go through the Pentagon Papers, which by the way I have done, there is absolutely no doubt about this. The idea that the United States was somehow lured into Vietnam or persuaded to interfere in Vietnam is completely wrong. But again, a lot of the decision making was poor. A lot of the intelligence collection was bad. There was again always the default position to the president and his officials that you have to be tough, you have to be strong, there mustn't be any retreat. There's always the pressure to get more and more deeply involved. And then eventually the United States was able to get out of Vietnam through a very complex diplomatic process. And the long-term effects were not that great because Southeast Asia, for all the attempts to talk it up its importance, was not in the end that important. The Middle East is extremely important. It is important in a completely different way. The stakes this time are much higher. Is that understood in Washington?
I think it is. I think it is. As you point out, Vietnam, Southeast Asia, the dominoes and all that stuff, it was a peripheral fight on the sort of the edges of the two great blocks, the Soviet bloc and the American bloc, and we're kicking each other under the table. You could say the same thing about the wars that took place in Angola and Mozambique and Central America to some extent. But without dominance of the Middle East, without the United States dollar resting on the petrodollar, the sense that everybody in the world has, we're the dominant power in every place in the world we choose to apply our power, I think that sweater unravels fairly quickly. And that's why I think it is existential. I mean, you're right. We survived a very humiliating. There was a complex political way we got out of Southeast Asia, but it ended up in a humiliating collapse of South Vietnam. But then, of course, we returned the favor to the Soviets in Afghanistan, and that actually did lead, in part, to the Soviet collapse. I think maybe we're looking at something, as I said earlier. Look, I've been saying for several years, the United States has to go through something similar to what the Soviet Union went through in the 1990s. And there's a very close symbiosis between the internal stability of the United States and our global empire, just like there was between the Soviet Union and the global communist movement, that when one goes down, they're both going down. And I think that's part of the thing that I think is starting to be appreciated when you look at how unstable things are here in the United States, as I alluded to earlier about our elections. There's a lot in terms of our constitutional system domestically that just doesn't work anymore. And if we have a major, not just high oil prices like we did in the early 1970s, but a major degradation of the status of the dollar, and that affects all the supply chains, that could have a very devastating effect internally in the United States.
Again, is that fully understood? Because there's a lot of people who continue to say, I read an article in the Financial Times today, who continue to say that the United States is fully insulated from the economic effects of this crisis. That, in fact, what it will do is cause investment flows to increase to the United States because it is the safe haven, that the United States is energy self-sufficient, that it will come through. It'll be the rest of the world that basically collapses, not the United States itself. I don't agree with that analysis, by the way. I think that is disastrously complacent. But is that view, which does seem from time to time to find reflections in some of Trump's comments, is that view, the Financial Times view, the one that carries weight, that carries traction in Washington?
I think that's a dominant one. I mean, you're familiar with the Talib Nassim Thanksgiving Day turkey analogy. Past his prologue, looks good. Oh, bam, then the head comes off. I think markets tend to look everything in terms of past performance. And I think politicians do as well. We also have to keep in mind the political situation in the United States. We've heard a lot of talk about how much of the MAGA base Trump is losing, with the Epstein files and now with this war. I think there's a lot more of it that still supports them than people might think. A lot of the younger crowd have checked out, but they tend to be rather cynical and skeptical about everything anyway. But you'd be shocked, and I heard this out at the polling places here in Virginia, how many people of the over 40 generation, the real Trumpanzees who believe everything the Orange Messiah says. He really could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and get away with it. As far as this crowd goes, they believe everything he says, everything they see on Fox News, and that base of support is still there. And I think that's what he's still counting on. I mean, it's only about maybe a quarter to 30% of the electorate, but it's still rock solid. And he still probably thinks he can pull a rabbit out of his hat if he can somehow spin this thing as a win. Or maybe if he fails that, we'll go invade Cuba instead, and that'll be a compensation prize.
Jim, any final thoughts? I mean, it looks like we're in an incredibly complex conflict. It doesn't seem as if there's any clear way through. I guess people would have said that about Vietnam too in 68.
Yeah.
That, in 1968, when Johnson finally stopped bombing and started the peace negotiations in Paris, it didn't look to many people as if that would last. And in fact, we did see lots of moments of extreme escalation afterwards. But will this thing somehow disentangle itself? Or is this process of escalation to that ultimate apocalyptic event, the use of nuclear weapons, is that now baked in the cake?
Yeah, I've heard that the light at the end of the tunnel has been turned off because of the lack of energy supplies. So there's no light at the end of the tunnel anymore, or it's a train coming. I obviously I don't know any more than you two gentlemen do in terms of what is going to happen. We can certainly look at what possibly could happen. I guess my view as an American is that since I think this day of reckoning must come, I'd rather it come sooner with less loss of life than later with greater loss of life. So I hope that if the Russians and Chinese, as well as the Iranians, are playing a careful game of chess, they can put us in a position where we have no choice but to disengage and suffer a huge humiliation, a huge loss at our international prestige. And that starts the sweater unraveling that leads to a shift in the internal order here in the United States. That's got to come. I'd rather it not happen, 2 or 3 years ago with a major conflict with Russia or China, and maybe one that does go nuclear that will have far more devastating consequences. We've got to get there one way or the other. I'd rather get there sooner and with less damage than later with greater damage.
Jim Jatras, thank you for answering my question so thoroughly and so well. I wonder if you could just wait a few minutes. I think Alex will want to put some questions to you from the viewers, but that's been a wonderful program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Real quick update. Iranian media close to the IRGC state that there were no negotiations between Iran and the U.S., and Trump retreated due to fear of Tehran's retaliatory actions.
I think that's probably correct. I'm not sure it was so much the retaliatory action fear. I don't think he ever intended to follow through with that threat. As I say, I think it's a cover for whatever comes next. I think it's probably going to be something to do with those Marines.
Yeah, there are a lot of statements coming out of Iran right now, Jim, Alexander, which say that there were no negotiations. That's what they're claiming. And those statements come out pretty quick, almost immediate, which would also signal that Iran is also trying to not allow the markets to be manipulated either.
Yes.
With such a quick statement.
Absolutely.
Anyway, from Nikos, Mr. Jatras, I've seen your podcast tour where you're urging Russia to strike Europe and thus start World War III, but you never consider the consequences.
No, I have not said
Is that,
no, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
Sorry. Well, I'm sorry. Is there more? Or should I address?
Yeah,
that
there's another part. Let me just read you the other part. Who is going to fight this war or survive the Holocaust? You have to live your life, or me and my generation who are left to clean up. In 1 second, the Western elites will do anything to preserve primacy, including nuclear war. They are currently destroying Iran, making the nation unlivable.
That's possible. I think a nuclear strike against Iran by the Americans, or more likely the Israelis, is not completely out of the question. I hope they're not that crazy. One never knows. As far as the Russians go, no, I've never said the Russians to strike Europe. I've said that given that we have direct American, British, and French strikes inside Russia, again, there's maybe a Ukrainian finger on the button, but we all know it's really those other powers striking Russia inside pre-1991 Russia. That simply striking back against targets in Iran, I don't think sends the message that needs to be sent. If I were the Russians, I would be looking at those British bases on Cyprus, again, with warning, with an Oreshnik, with no warhead, to say, look, if you're going to strike inside our territory, we're going to strike yours. We're not going to escalate to anything close to even hitting in your home countries. But if you're going to keep this up, that's what we're going to get. I think that, again, back we were saying earlier, all this caution from Moscow simply projects an image of weakness. The other side says, well, they threaten consequences, but instead they just hit the Ukrainians harder. I don't think that gets the message across. It just tells the NATO people, Russia's weak, Russia's afraid of us. We can keep doing this. We can keep escalating. I think that's the real danger there.
Sparky says, Scott Bessent is a Soros stooge skilled at pushing value down in order to take advantage of short positions. This ranges from individual stocks, bonds, or commodities up to the world economy.
I think we've long since lost our moral innocence when it comes to the fact that corrupt people will make a killing on policies that they have a hand in implementing. And that, look, I mean, does this surprise anybody now?
Yeah. From Taharka, are we 100% sure Iran doesn't already have a nuclear weapon?
100% sure, no, but I don't think it's likely. Apparently, Witkoff was saying, of course, if you can trust anything he says, that the Iranians were very proudly telling him about their 60% enrichment. They could move forward on that very soon, which he took as a reason to say, well, I guess we better go hit them now. Iran has been a threshold state for a very long time, and one of a number of states in the world. And they, a lot of people want to say, oh, Iran has not developed a nuclear weapon because we've stopped them from doing so. We've hit their nuclear facilities or we've strangled their enrichment. No, none of that's true. The only reason they don't have a nuclear weapon is because they have not made a decision to make one. And I believe they could do one in shorter order anytime they wanted to. And so they don't really need to have one right now. But I think they're facing kind of a, Fisher cut bait decision on we're going to do it, we better do it now, because we may not want to wait until after the Israelis strike us with their nukes.
All right. Here's a question from Fernando. What if Iran fails? Impeachment, civil unrest for Trump? What if Trump? That's a good question. What if Trump fails?
Yeah.
What happens to him?
I honestly, I think first off, I think it's almost certain that he's going to lose the House in November, and he is going to be impeached. Will he be removed? I think that depends on what happens in the Senate. Yeah, if this war turns out to be a horrible, dismal failure, I think the prospects that he would be removed go up very dramatically. And depending on how bad it is, it could even happen before November under the 25th Amendment. I think civil unrest is a whole other story. I think that's coming anyway. It could come sooner and in a more acute form if this war turns into a big disaster.
Here's a question for you, Jim, from Sparky, about the missiles towards Diego Garcia were an Israel-sponsored false flag. Do you think it was a false flag, the missiles to Diego Garcia?
I don't think so. I mean, I suppose it's possible. I mean, they would be launched from what, Israeli submarines, perhaps, or something like that. I'm not sure what the Israelis necessarily would have gotten out of that, except, I mean, how does it help the Israelis to expose what could be an American vulnerability and a greater than anticipated Iranian capability? I don't see where the plus is for them there.
All right, one more question for Jim from Elena. The UN General Assembly condemned Iran, the country that was attacked. What good is the UN anymore, Jim?
It isn't. I've never been a big believer in the UN. I thought the only really useful part of the UN was the Security Council. Something was missing, of course, in the League of Nations, which was, I think, in function, if not in intent, was to be something like an approximation of the Council, the Concert of Europe that existed in the 19th century. You get all the big powers around the table, and if they can come to an agreement on action, then action is possible. If they can't, at least you don't back a major power into the corner where he has no choice but to fight. And that's the way the system was supposed to work, and actually more or less did work for several decades. And until, remember, that's the reason we've had all these calls to remove the veto in the security, deprive Russia of its veto. That'll, we can have non-unanimous decision making. That's a recipe for war. I mean, the reason the veto was there and the reason the Security Council was there was so that no major power would be forced to fight for survival. And I think that's been the good thing about the UN. The General Assembly, that's just where the rabble mouth off. Who cares about that?
One more for you, Jim. From Elliot, Qatar had a good relationship with Iran. Can it be repaired?
That's a good question. Of course, there the common nexus was gas. I mean, there's been a lot of focus in the last few weeks about oil. But the real question right now is gas, it seems to me, that those are the facilities that seem to have been damaged more than the oil producing facilities. And I suppose that there's still a basis once this war wraps up for there'll be some relationship between the two countries. I don't know if the Al Thani family will still be in power in Qatar at that point. But at some point, I think when this war ends one way or the other, especially if, as we've discussed, Iran becomes the regional hegemon, the Qataris will have to play ball.
One more question, Jim, and I'll let you go. This is coming from locals. What do you say to people who are saying that Iran is no unicorn regime? They are a brutal autocratic regime and have been a menace in the region for decades.
I don't think they've been a menace in the region for decades, but look, I'll be blunt about this. I'm not a fan of the Iranian government or the Islamic regime in Tehran. I'm a Christian. I'm not a Muslim, not a Shia Muslim. I think there's some very ugly things about that regime, just like I thought there were ugly things about, obviously, the communist regimes that used to exist in Russia and so forth. And that doesn't mean I'm in favor, though, of doing crazy things and going to war with them. That despite whatever their ideology is and some of their domestic practices are, North Korea, for example, you still need to conduct state-to-state relations in a rational way that serve your interest and don't blow up the whole world in the process. I think we've lost sight of that. They're bad, so we get to go kill them. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Who's really bad then if you go around the world destroying every regime that you think doesn't run its internal affairs the way we think we should?
Thank you, Jim. From Game of Chairs, to quote Sir Arthur Harris, they have sowed the wind and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
So it seems.
All right. Thank you for answering the questions. Jim, it was great having you on.
Thank you.
Alexander, you're muted. You're muted, Alexander.
I just wanted to say thanks to Jim for coming on this program. Yeah.
Jim,
Thank you.
once
Wishing
again,
you
the best place to follow you is on X, correct?
on X, that's the only place, at Jim Jatras, and wishing you both a blessed Pascha.
Evcharisto.
Jim, all the
Thanks.
best. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.